Okay, everyone, welcome to chapter 26, um, where we begin a new section. Really, up until this point, the world of Greek has been divided into two categories, right? Nouns and verbs. Under nouns, you had prepositions and adjectives and everything related to nouns, and then you had verbs. And so I'm just going to be as upfront with you as possible. By the time most Greek students get to participles, it's always later in the first year. You have less time ahead of you in Greek, at least in the undergraduate at the undergraduate level, than you do, and you got less time ahead of you than you do behind you. And for the most part, participles always give students trouble. They don't give students trouble because they're hard to spot. We're going to go through some of that in this lecture. Really, what this lecture is, chapter 26, this is about introducing participles. But I want to let you know a couple of things before we get started. So, the real trouble with participles is not recognizing them. They are verbs that have noun quality or adjective qualities, really. And so, in addition to all the things you have to remember about verbs, you add nouns onto that. They're going to be pretty easy to recognize. When you're reading sentences, you're going to be able to spot participles pretty easily. The challenge with participles is going to come in translating them. And so here's what I want you to do. If you have not read chapter 26 in your textbook, I want you to pause this video and I want you to go through it with a pencil or an ink pen. I want you to read every word of it. I want you to underline things that you think are important. And I want you to really get a sense for what participles are. And then I want you to watch the lecture. And that way you maybe can get a little something that you missed. And I'm going to say the same thing in the next lecture for chapter 27. And if I can remember, I'm going to say it for every chapter moving forward. So if you haven't read chapter 26 in your textbook, I want you to go ahead and do that now. So now that you've done that, let's go ahead and let's take a look at participles. And like a lot of things that we do in this class, we're going to just kind of follow along with the textbook, at a higher level. Most of this, you're just going to be digging out of the textbook yourself. But what a participle is, we have participles in English. It's what we call Greek and participle, what we call a participle in Greek, essentially is what we do when we add ing to a word in English. And so the way that we're going to describe participles, generally speaking, it is that they are verbal adjectives, which means they share characteristics of both a verb and an adjective. So as a verb, it's going to have tense and voice, present, active, indicative, right? As an adjective, it's going to have case, nominative, number, singular, gender, masculine. And I just use those as an example, right? So it is a word that in English, we add ing onto it. Instead of eat, eating, instead of study, studying, right? So he was eating, right? That is a verb that is describing was in that case, what he was doing. And all this will make sense a little later. But it's a verbal adjective, and as a verb, it has tense and voice. As an adjective, it has case, number, and gender. And here's a couple of examples that he gives in the textbook. While eating, my Greek teacher gave us the final. Eating is a participle that tells us something about the verb gave, right? A participle can have modifiers, like it can be a direct object or an adverb. When it has those modifiers, it's going to form a participial phrase. So just like prepositional phrases, you'll be able to pick out participial phrases. And again, this chapter is just sort of a general 30,000 foot view of participles. And starting with the next chapter, we'll jump into the specific participles that you'll have to know for this course. But if you try and remember a couple of things moving forward about participles, is that if you could just think about the ing, eating versus eat, studying versus study, then that's going to really help you with your translation. And that's not all there is to it. You're not just going to be able to just put ing and then move on with your life. In a lot of cases, you're going to have other words that you're going to have to supply. They're going to help you with translation. And this is really, participles are really what help give exegetical life to passages. And once you understand participles, when you're listening to sermons or you're reading journal articles and people are breaking down the Greek text of the New Testament and they start talking about a word being a participle, you're going to recognize really quickly that the way that we translate participles into English from Greek almost never really communicates all the stuff that we're trying to communicate with the participle. So this is where in your teaching and preaching and your devotional life, so understanding participles is really going to advance that to the next level, because you'll be able to fill in those gaps as the teacher. When you're forming participles, you're going to have a verbal stem. In this case, the first one is luo, I lose, a morpheme, and we'll look at all of this. We'll look at all of this later. You'll have a morpheme, and the morpheme is really what's going to help you identify the participle. You have the morpheme, and then you have the case ending. So we've already said this. Verbal adjective has tense. Examples are present, aorist, and perfect. Has voice, active, middle, and passive. As an adjective, has case, number, and gender, and most of your basic translations are going to have ing. And now this is the exegetical part of this is the part that just adding ing is not going to really communicate. So in Greek, in the Greek language, your participle essentially has two functions. The first, when it is an adverbial participle. So the adverbial participle, the action, eating, studying, drinking, walking, the action described by the participle is directed towards the verb. So when you have an adverbial participle, and you'll be able to recognize all these, don't get too wrapped around the axle right now. We're just kind of, remember, we're moving at 30,000 foot here. So if the participle is being used as an adverbial participle, then when you're forming your sentence and forming your translation, then you're going to know that the action of the participle is being directed towards the verb. If it's an adjectival participle, as you can imagine, the action described by the participle, eating, studying, walking, talking, modifies a noun or a pronoun. Right? So those are just two categories that you're going to live in. And when you get into the New Testament, those nuances make a really big difference in how we translate the meaning of the text. And participles, you got to know participles. He gives a number in the textbook of how many participles there are in the New Testament. I think it's something like 6,800, something like that. So you're going to encounter participles. when it comes to the elements, the verbal elements, remember there's verbal and adjectival elements. So when it comes to the verbal elements, you're going to have the imperfective, the perfective, and the combinative. That combinative is that word that he introduced in the last series. But you can see here in the orangish red, you can see the you can I'll show you right here. You can see the morpheme that we're talking about. You've got the verbal stem, and then you got the morpheme here, and then you got the case ending. So when it comes to verbal elements, that morpheme is going to be what really sets it apart. And all of this, he actually explains this better in the next chapter. But you have the imperfective, you see the nu and the tau, perfective, the nu and the tau, and then the combinative is the omicron and the tau. So these are all those that are built on sort of that are built on the verbal tenses. And then you've got voice, right? Active, passive, middle, because you have verbs, you have present, aorist, and then you have the active, passive, or middle. You can see here that in the active, the word that the participle modifies, so the participle will be eating, drinking, studying, talking, walking. That participle, the word it modifies, is doing the action. I am eating, right? When it's passive, the word it modifies is receiving the action. So the only way I can really explain this to you is that if a participle is in the active voice, then it is delivering the action. The word that it modifies is delivering the action. Whereas passive, if you can think about if somebody is being passive, they're having something done to them, then the word that the participle modifies is receiving the action. So you receive a pass, about the best way I know to say it. And then the middle voice, the word it modifies is doing the action. So similar to the active voice. And again, we'll go through all this when we go through the different tenses and voices. So you're going to have really three different general categories of participle: imperfective, perfective, and combinative. You're going to deal primarily with three different tense stems: present, aorist, and perfect. And you're going to deal with three different aspects: continuous, undefined, and completed. Now, those are the elements of the verb. So it's a verbal adjective. So those are the elements of a participle that are related to a verb. Here are the elements of a participle that are related to an adjective. It is going to agree with the word it modifies in case, number, and gender. It's going to make it really easy for you because you know how Greek is up to this point. In English, then that participle is going to fall in a specific word order place, right? Because we value word order in English. Greek doesn't value word order like that. And so, the participle and the word it modifies may be separated by 2 or 3 words. So the good news is that the participle is going to agree with the word it modifies in case, number, and gender. That's going to make it really easy for you. A few other elements. Some of the modifiers that you're going to find of the participles, direct objects are going to modify them, prepositional or prepositions, which will make them prepositional phrases. Adverbs will all modify the participle. For participles, they're negated, not with omicron upsilon, but they're negated with Meta, eta, may. And then when you parse the participle, you're going to parse the elements of the verb, and you're going to parse the elements of the adjective. Now, a lot of different ways to do it. What I want you to do when you're parsing participles is I want you to parse the verbal elements first and then the adjectival elements second. That makes it really easy for me to grade stuff. I'm not trying to go through making sure you've got everything right because it's in some weird order. Just make sure that you're parsing the verbal elements first and then the adjectival elements. And so we're going to discuss participles in the next 4 chapters, which is going to carry us through the rest of the semester. So you're ending Greek on participles. It's really important that you learn these. It's not going to be easy. It's just not. The parsing is not going to be hard. I think that you've probably all figured out how to do that by now and how to study that and how to memorize that. It's not going to be that hard. The toughest part of this is going to be the translation, and we're going to talk about translation in chapter 27. But here's what I want you to know. Here's what I want you to remember when you're doing your workbook exercises, when you're doing your sentences, when you're doing your quizzes and tests, is that you've encountered enough words and you've encountered enough sort of parsing that some of this is probably coming a little easier than others. Like you see lues, well, you know what that is, right? You see the article, you know what that is. There are just certain aspects that you probably see that are coming a little easier. But even if you recognize a participle, I'm gonna ask that you slow down, that you answer some questions that I'm gonna go through the textbook. Mounce gives you sort of a list of elements you need to consider when you're thinking about translating. You're going to add an ing in almost every case. In fact, I think in this course, every case. But you may add while, you may add because, right? You need to look for that. You need to look for that negating modifier may. So you're just going to have to ask some questions to make sure that you get the right translation. And at the end of the day, you may just translate the word with ing and you don't know whether to put while or you don't know whether to put because. And this is where you're going to have to make a decision as a translator of what communicates what's being said in that sentence the most. Because context is the biggest key to translating participles correctly. And so that's why participles are one of the greatest examples of why any language besides Greek that you are reading the New Testament in is in some way less efficient and less accurate than the Greek because you're translating from Greek into another language. And so that's why we do this. That's why you are in Bible college. That's the reason you are taking Greek, is because every generation of people in your position have to be the ones to carry this torch forward or we lose it. So participles from now to the end of the semester. That's going to wrap up this lecture, this overview, and we'll do chapter 27. So I'll see you in a bit.